Howdy y'all, the kickboxing historian here, and I'm going to start this one with a little bit of a confession. I don't really want to be sitting here making this video. The nation has gone through so much lately with the global pandemic and cratering of the economy that I'd like to focus on something that makes me happier and gives me hope. My scholarship, the Brother Cadfael novel I'm reading, the comedy show Letterkenny, in other words, just about anything other than the serious, gut-wrenching, and traumatic events that we've been dealing with. But I really feel like I have no choice. Across the nation, people have marched in protest sparked by the killing of George Floyd, the 46-year-old father whom a police officer killed by kneeling on his neck. Night after night, at various places across the country, some of the protesters have purposefully damaged property in order to force people to hear what they're saying, while in other instances, anger has exploded into spontaneous violence committed by both protesters and police. Sometimes the police have undeniably committed acts of violence aimed at intimidating the protesters and forcing the protests to end. Throughout the 6 nights of protest, there has been an utter failure on the part of the president to address these protests in any meaningful way, while the man who hopes to be president has been slow out of the gate with a useful response. Now, I said before that the killing of George Floyd sparked these nationwide protests, because while we shouldn't forget the death that acted as the final straw for so many people, the grievances that are being expressed in these protests run far deeper than one man's tragic, preventable, and violent death. A glance at Mr. Floyd's life, though, shows us some of the reasons why the anger is over more than just his death, and why firing these 3 cops and charging one with murder will do little to address the complex problems at play. Those problems are the results of long-running injustices and systemic racism that pervade our society. Floyd was born in North Carolina. And though the state does better than many in the South, racism and racial inequality remain endemic. Schools have become increasingly segregated since the 1990s, eroding the 2 previous decades of improvement seen in the state. Deep and violent racism persists, as shown in 2019 when 2 high school students chatted online about murdering black babies. And a pattern of racism in jury selection has called the justice of the state's criminal justice system into question. Things certainly didn't improve for Floyd when he moved to Houston, Texas, when he was young. This is a city the Department of Housing and Human Development declared in violation of the Civil Rights Act in 2017 for, quote, blocking and deterring affordable housing proposals in integrated neighborhoods, a major factor in the city's high rates of racial segregation. That segregation has important real-world impacts. Not only do people of differing races not learn to better get along with one another and to think of one another as worthy of respect, but the schools in predominantly black areas of Houston perform far worse than those in predominantly white areas. Thanks to a history of redlining, black residents were once forced to live in areas with substandard housing for many decades while missing out on the opportunity to amass the wealth necessary to live a middle-class lifestyle because they weren't allowed to buy their own homes. Formal or informal housing compacts continued to restrict African Americans from moving out of areas that were predominantly black, while they also weren't allowed to buy homes even in those areas. Once discrimination ended, the situation hardly improved, which is why African Americans continued to live in the same neighborhoods where their parents and grandparents lived. Absentee landlords often failed to maintain these properties well, allowing them to further decline in value. And since schools obtain their funding primarily through local property taxes, those in predominantly African American neighborhoods tend to be underfunded and thus of poor quality. Therefore, when George Floyd dropped out of school, it's likely he left an institution that struggled to provide a quality education or support for its students. I honestly don't know if this is true, but statistics are on my side. But really, while many Americans would like to think these are all Southern problems, that's far from the truth. I live just down the road from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the Milwaukee metropolitan region is the most segregated in the nation. Thanks largely to that segregation and the history of redlining in the city, property taxes in the African American parts of Milwaukee don't bring in enough money to support schools of the quality or with the comprehensive support networks necessary to support the students who attend these schools. Therefore, in spite of the hard work of many dedicated teachers, some of whom are my former students, and support staff, far too many young people fall through the cracks in the Milwaukee public school system, which is also true of inner city and impoverished schools across the nation. The problem is compounded by another problem George Floyd faced in his all too short life: mass incarceration. The United States not only locks up more of its population than any other country in the world, it also locks up its citizens at a much higher rate than any other country. We have over 2.3 million people behind bars, and taken as a percentage of our population, this makes the United States far worse than Russia, Rwanda, or even El Salvador. China is an acknowledged police state, and Russia is a dictatorship in all but name, and yet the U.S. incarceration rate is 698 per 100,000, compared to 445 and 119 per 100,000 in Russia and China, respectively. We arrest so many people in the United States that it's impossible to give everyone a fair trial. Constitutional protections be damned. Although we regularly see exciting court trials portrayed on TV and in movies, in reality, court trials almost never happen. 97% of all federal cases and 94% of state cases instead end in plea bargains. And of course, a disproportionate number of those entangled by the criminal justice system are black, because police are more likely to stop African Americans than whites in both traffic and street stops, even though there is no evidence of greater criminality among African Americans. Furthermore, 27.4% of African Americans live in poverty compared to 9.9% of white Americans, meaning that more African Americans will confront the court system without being able to afford to pay a lawyer on their own, leaving them with an overworked and underpaid public defender who is more likely to urge their client to accept a plea deal than if he or she was being paid by a well-heeled client. Many accept these plea bargains in spite of their innocence, due to the fear of suffering worse consequences, a failure to understand the charges leveled against them, or simply to get out of jail when bail is unaffordable and remaining locked up means job loss, loss of a place to live, and a host of other bad problems. As The Atlantic reports, quote, according to the Prison Policy Initiative, 630,000 people are in jail on any given day, and 443,000 of them, 70%, are in pretrial detention. Many of these defendants are facing minor charges that would not mandate further incarceration, but they lack the resources to make bail and secure their freedom. Some, therefore, feel compelled to take whatever deal the prosecutor offers, even if they are innocent. End quote. All of these factors and more lead to African Americans being incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans, many of them for crimes they didn't commit. I don't know if that was the case with George Floyd, who accepted a plea deal when charged with home invasion in 2009. But regardless of his guilt or innocence, prison likely offered little in the way of job training or rehabilitative efforts, instead focusing on dehumanization and punishment. When he got out, Mr. Floyd would have received little support, and saddled with a felony record, it's no wonder he then struggled to find a job. His experience is depressingly common among African American men. According to the Sentencing Project, quote, the percentage of black men with a felony conviction increased from 13% in 1980 to 33% in 2010. Compare that to 5% and 13% for all adult men during these periods. The percentage of black men who had experienced in prison increased from 6% in 1980 to 15% in 2010, compared to 2% and 6% for all adult men during these periods, respectively. End quote. Look at that statistic again. 1/3 of all black men have a felony conviction on their record now. Having such a conviction can invalidate many rights other Americans enjoy as a matter of course. For example, in 21 states, felons lose their right to vote while incarcerated and for some time after, and in 11 states, some felons lose their voting rights indefinitely. In others, such as Florida, the burdens to regain voting rights are so onerous that many will never be able to jump through all the required hoops. But voting may be the least of a felon's worries, since many struggle to find employment or housing. This compounds the difficulties African Americans already face, given the implicit and explicit biases that make employers more likely to call white applicants with a felony in for an interview than a college graduate with no criminal record and a, quote, black-sounding name. This is only one of the many forms of bias that African Americans face when seeking employment or housing. In short, it's hard to be an African American even in the best of times, and we aren't living in the best of times by a long shot. Even for those African Americans with a job, and even before the global pandemic, African American unemployment was nearly twice that for whites. odds are they'll be paid less, are less likely to have a position in management, and of vital importance given the pandemic we're living through, about half as likely to have a job that can be done remotely than a white American. This is one of the many reasons why African Americans are more likely to sicken and die from COVID-19 than white Americans. I don't want to reduce George Floyd to a statistic. I don't want to devalue his life or lessen the impact of his death in any way. However, while his death sparked the current protest happening in America, these protests are about more than just one man being killed by a cop kneeling on his throat. There's a great deal of justifiable anger that has been bubbling beneath the surface for a long time. This is anger at an economic system in which African Americans are more often losers than winners, which is why some protesters have attacked economic symbols such as big box retail stores, banks, and even smaller neighborhood stores. This is anger over militarized police forces that unjustly target African Americans, leading to their overrepresentations in jails and in prisons, which is why some protesters attacked a Minneapolis police station. And it's certainly anger over a president with a history of racist rhetoric, who personally paid for ads calling for the execution of a group of black and Latino teens wrongly accused of rape, who championed the conspiracy theory that America's first black president wasn't born in the United States, and who has ignored the plight of African Americans, which is why some protesters have targeted the White House. It's not as if people haven't tried to tell President Trump something is very wrong in America. Over the last few years, protesters have blocked traffic on highways and city streets to protest police violence in places as disparate as Chicago, Illinois, and Atlanta, Georgia. The quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, Colin Kaepernick, began kneeling during the national anthem in order to protest police violence and racism, soon followed by a growing number of other NFL players. Sadly, none of this is even new, as thousands of protesters had marched against police brutality in Washington, D.C. in 2014, 2 years before Trump's election. However, these years of peaceful protest have not only failed to have any positive impact, but they've all too often been met by derision, anger, and threats of violence from white Americans, including President Trump. This is, after all, the same man who said there were, quote, very fine people among the white nationalists who marched at Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, where one of these men murdered a woman. In recent days, President Trump has tweeted that when, quote, the looting starts, the shooting starts, mimicking, if not quoting, the longtime police chief of Miami, Walter Headley, who was known to use brutal measures against black men in his city. Even more recently, Trump berated the nation's governors for being weak and not using military force to, quote, dominate the protesters. Hopefully cooler heads will prevail, though that remains to be seen. If any governor is so unwise as to follow Trump's advice, the result will be a disaster. In the 1960s, violence broke out in a number of U.S. cities from Los Angeles to Detroit before exploding into a whirlwind of unrest in over 120 cities across the nation following Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in 1968. The police and military forces deployed against these protesters, leaving some 3,500 injured, 43 dead, and 27,000 arrested. Deployment of the military may allow the government to crush those who oppose it, but it will do nothing to get at the roots of the despair and anguish that fuel these protests. Look back at what happened after the violence of 1968. President Johnson established the Kerner Commission to get at the roots of the problem, and as the Smithsonian Magazine describes, this commission found many of the problems that still exist today, such as that, quote, racial discrimination limited African Americans' ability to escape from poverty. Moreover, the report deplored a common reaction to riots, arming police officers with more deadly weapons to use in heavily populated urban neighborhoods. That should sound familiar to us all. Its primary recommendation was a policy which combines, as the report put it, ghetto enrichment with programs designed to encourage integration of substantial numbers of Negroes into the society outside the ghetto. Those are the words of the report. Obviously, those were not taken to heart. Most white Americans reacted with anger toward the Kerner Commission report, and the government ignored it, which is why more than 50 years later so many problems persist. To let this situation continue on is not just morally wrong, it is plainly stupid. This is not the time to use force to support the protesters. If President Trump were any sort of leader at all, he would at the very least address the nation and try to tone down the level of anger instead of stoking it. Joe Biden is at least trying to talk the talk, meeting personally with an array of African American leaders and promising specific reforms, such as more oversight and training for police officers and more economic opportunities for the African American community. I would have been happier if this response hadn't followed an earlier knee-jerk call to end violence, not because I condone violence, but because it indicates he was slow to think about the root causes of these problems. Still, it's a damn sight better than threatening to shoot protesters. Now, if you like this sort of content, if you want to hear more, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will be posting another video within the next week or two.